My name is Richard Nesbitt. I'm the CEO of Global Risk Institute. We are videoing this today, and we may intend to use this at a future date for an e-learning course that we're preparing. But what we want to do today is announce the kickoff of our Enterprise Risk Management Roadmap. And I'm going to introduce it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike Stramalia, who is going to talk to you about what this roadmap is all about. So one of the primary goals of the Global Risk Institute is to improve risk management for financial services through education and training. And that's what this is designed to do today. What we want to do is lay out a comprehensive enterprise risk management roadmap that takes you through our approach to the management of risk. There are many approaches to management of risk. They all have their unique features. The way we're going to do that is we have a series of modules. Mike, hi Dennis. Mike's going to talk to you about what those modules are. And there's going to be a series of interactive workshops, business case exercises, research. We're going to provide you with research on these different modules. And for the next several months, we're going to be rolling out each of these modules. Of course, we focus on financial services, so we've tailored our program towards financial services. A lot of these concepts would apply to other industries as well. Those of you who are at banks will know a lot about risk appetite statement, but we have to remember not everybody knows as much about risk appetite statements as the major banks do. And so, of course, a lot of our work revolves around defining that risk appetite statement. Mike and I believe that risk culture is the most important part of the enterprise risk management roadmap. And so we spent a lot of time talking and thinking about the impact of culture in an organization. And of course, some of the recent catastrophes in industry have been about defective risk cultures. So we think that is the fundamental central point of the enterprise risk. So this framework revolves heavily around the objectives and strategies of the company itself. What's unique about our approach is it's really driven and started by the strategy of the company. So unlike one that might be created by engineers or one that's created by accountants, where strategy is a small part of what the framework is designed to achieve, we think it is what the framework is designed to achieve, which is the strategy of the company in a risk optimal way. And Mike's going to talk about that as he delivers a summary of what the framework will look like. So with that, I'm going to introduce Mike Stramalia. Mike is executive in residence here at the Global Risk Institute and has been working in the area of risk management for many, many years.
Great. Thanks. As Richard said, we believe that any discussion about ERM really needs to begin with organizational objectives, because they really need to provide the overarching context for all of our risk management activities and dialogue. Now, organizations develop objectives and embody them in the form of things like their organizational mission and vision and business goals, and then endeavor to achieve those objectives by allocating resources against them, developing strategies and plans, etc. And of course, we know that's a necessary but not sufficient activity. They need to successfully execute on that plan. And if they can do all that effectively, and maybe with a little bit of luck, they can indeed achieve those objectives. But as we know, in the real world, there's a lot of things that can get in the way of that happening. And that's a reflection of the inherent uncertainty that really underlies our overall business and operating environment. And that's certainly true of any organization, but it's particularly true, I think, for a financial services organization whose business model is fundamentally all about taking risk in order to achieve return. So managing uncertainty and dealing with inherent uncertainty is very much an integral part of our world. So within that context, we think about the ERM framework very simply as the technology, the tools, and the capability that we bring to the equation to really help us to deal with that uncertainty, and as a result, increase our confidence level for achieving the objectives. And it's really as simple as that in terms of the context. It's not about doing it because it sounds like the right thing to do or to satisfy a regulatory objective. It's all about helping to raise the confidence in our ability to achieve overriding business objectives. And so with that sort of overarching context, we've developed what we think is a robust module and all the key components in order to meet that need. And I don't think there's any particular surprises here. I think any risk framework that you're going to see is going to include some variation of these elements. What we tried to do, though, is kind of assemble these in a way that we think is cohesive, that is appropriately aligned with the particular issues and opportunities of the financial services sector. And as Richard said, then have sort of taken that and built out a set of teaching aids and tools to help to communicate, foster a dialogue, and build some ongoing learning around those practices. What I'd like to do is just briefly go around the wheel and hit some of the highlights about that program and talk about the various modules, starting with the risk appetite. And we start there because risk appetite really provides the key interface between organizational objectives and its risk-taking activities. So we think of it as the bridge or the conduit that really makes that connection. So our teaching module reviews three key elements that we think are required in order to successfully implement and manage your risk appetite, starting with defining it. So you need to be able to effectively articulate what the risk appetite is. And we believe that needs to be a top-down process that starts with a clear understanding of the overall risk-taking philosophy and the core principles that embody that. That needs to be cascaded down into more granular control points and guidance and qualitative and quantitative criteria. And our workshop will talk about some of the practices that might help to do that. But of course, you can have a beautifully crafted risk appetite that you've well defined. Doesn't do you any good unless you can effectively embed it in the business and actually use it to drive decision making. And that's what the second stage of that risk appetite framework is, where it actually is being deployed both at a strategic level, so helping to guide the overall strategy of the organization, and also tactically in terms of guiding day-to-day decision making. And then the third element is the overall control environment that we bring around that to ensure that are we indeed achieving the results that we expected? Is our risk taking moving the ball down the field in terms of driving towards those objectives? Is it suggesting we need to recalibrate our risk appetite or our business objectives over time? So recognizing that's a continuous sort of feedback loop. So the module will explore each of these elements, and as part of that, we'll also review the key elements of the risk appetite statement and how it needs to reflect each of those components. Then brings to the next module, which is risk identification. And in here, we'll explore how we go about developing a risk inventory that links back to the risk appetite and the business objectives. We'll explore the use of some diagnostic tools, such as the bow tie model that you might have heard of, and other tools that help us to differentiate and understand and manage things like risk factors, risk events, risk consequences, what's the relationship and the differences between each of those. As we have with all of our workshops, we have a number of exercises and business cases that will help to give us some hands-on experience with some of those tools. We're also going to review some of the best practices around the identification of emerging risks, and then work within the workshop to develop a high-level scan of some of the emerging risks facing the financial services sector, and talk about some of the linkages to GRI's research agenda and how that's hopefully helping to advance some of our collective thinking around some of those emerging risks. Next module is around risk measurement and assessment. So here, that obviously the methods and practices applied to the measurement of risk. So it includes a review of stress and scenario testing techniques that are being used in the financial services sector, And we'll look at some of the infrastructure prerequisites that are required to support those activities. So including things like how do we ensure data quality, what's our computational capacity, how do we manage risk models, etc. But having said all that, I want to be clear that one of the key premises of this module is that understanding risk really needs to extend well beyond just mathematical and statistical estimates of loss distributions. Therefore, qualitative methods that require more general business judgment are a key part of our thinking and content here. And I think this module provides a good example. I think of another one of our beliefs is that effective risk management is really both an art and a science. And at the end of the day, there is no real substitute for professional judgment, certainly informed by tools and technology, but also importantly, things like broad-based stakeholder dialogue, experience, and input. The environment in which the financial services sector operates, as we all know, is increasingly complex, a lot more rapid change, and there's a lot more interconnectedness, and those are some of the themes that we're going to be exploring here. And the idea is to introduce some techniques that hopefully, by addressing some of those issues, will provide a more robust approach towards risk assessment that will help to support greater corporate agility in driving towards those business objectives. Under risk budgeting and actions, we're going to begin with a review of looking at inherent and residual risks, and inventory the wide range of management actions that organizations can undertake in order to migrate a risk position from a gross to a net position that is more appropriately aligned with its risk appetite. Key principle here, though, is that we also recognize that there are no free lunches, and that in that process, there's always going to be inherent risk-return trade-offs, and we're going to walk through a framework to try to understand and identify what some of those trade-offs are. We also recognize that risk-taking capacity is a finite and valuable resource, and as a result, it needs to be allocated in a disciplined and optimal manner. The module outlines some principles and management questions that we need to consider in allocating risk-taking capacity across and down through the organization. And here again, we've developed a number of business case exercises to help to explore some of those themes, and they'll play a key role in, we believe, helping to foster some good active dialogue between all the workshop participants, and help to share some of our experiences and learnings as we collectively drive some thought leadership in this area. Under risk governance and control, perhaps not the most exciting part of the framework, but certainly a very important one. Here, we've tried to address what we think are really the four key pillars of a strong governance control framework, which include structure. How is the organization organized? Things like committees, committee mandates. What are the processes and procedures that are in place? Things like active monitoring. How clear are the role accountabilities? And in that context, we're going to talk about the three lines of defense model and roles of different stakeholders, both within the organization and outside the organization, and the role they play from an accountability perspective. And then, of course, all the policies, guidelines, and standards that we all know and love in our organization, I'm sure. So we're going to review each of those and try to link that to some of the emerging regulatory trends and issues, which obviously have some very strong connectivity to this area, and explore what's happening there, both in the Canadian context, but also internationally, given our global perspective. Under risk reporting and communication, we're going to survey the wide range of stakeholders, both internally and externally, that form the audience for our communication around both our risk profile and how we go about managing that risk in our organizations. And in this area, we recognize that risk information is often, by its nature, inherently complex. It can be very analytics intensive, to say the least. So there's two key themes that we really try to promote in this module. First one is that risk reporting needs to be provided in an overall business context. And there needs to be clear linkage, again, back to those business objectives and goals. And risk appetite provides an important conduit in that regard. That's a recurring theme. And the second one is that form really matters. So very often how we communicate about risk, including how we use technology and visuals, is often as important as what we're saying. And some very powerful emerging tools and technology in this area that can help to address this requirement that we'd like to explore as well in our workshop. The framework outlines 8 key elements of effective communication and how these need to be addressed when conveying information about risk. In particular, we review how effective communication about risk needs to be timely, needs to be accurate, needs to be comprehensive, consistent over time, but at the same time adaptable. So obviously there's some inherent tension there that needs to be reconciled. It needs to be relevant so that it can actually support decision making and be actionable. It needs to be clear and understandable, obviously, to the audience, and it needs to be proportionate so that we're spending the right amount of time on the most significant, larger risks that really matter, and not unduly focusing on some of the less material elements. And then finally, we have risk culture. And as Richard said, this is a particular area of focus within our framework, an area that we spend a lot of time thinking about, trying to build some thought leadership and practices around. And indeed, as we've all seen, a lot of the commentary coming out of the financial crisis is certainly focused on the failures in risk culture within the sector, and we've tried to learn from those. So at GRI, we very simply define risk culture as being the values, systems, and behaviors, so those 3 elements that collectively direct an organization's risk-taking activities. Pretty straightforward, but a lot easier to talk about than it is to actually implement and assess and influence over time. But it absolutely needs to be very much at the core of the overall ERM framework and the consciousness of the organization. So let me briefly comment on each of those 3 elements, starting with values, which is really the sort of the intangible or the cognitive element of risk culture. So it embodies the ideas, the knowledge, and beliefs regarding the attitudes or philosophy about risk within the organization. And that kind of builds up over long periods of time based on shared history. And it includes the beliefs around the answers to questions like, what are the risks that we think we understand within the organization, that we think we're good at managing, that we get paid for. And those are often very, very strong grounded in the organization. So it's often the most difficult element to change of those 3. The second element is the more tangible one. So it's really the collection of systems, so things like your incentive compensation systems, performance management, whistleblower, how your training around risk management, etc. There's obviously quite a long list of those. Those are a little easier to identify, a little easier to kind of change over time, and do play a key role in helping to direct risk-taking behavior. And behavior then is really both an output of those values and systems and an input, because there is a feedback loop as the organization observes the type behavior and what gets recognized and what gets sanctioned and what doesn't. That sends out very clear messages in terms of the type of risk-taking behavior that's expected and acceptable and what isn't. So we talk a lot about how do we kind of reinforce that feedback loop and make sure it's a constructive one. So we're creating a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle of feedback through that dynamic. So in our module, we're going to explore each of those elements and the components, the relationship between them, and through our work, we've kind of identified what we believe are sort of 9 key hallmarks that help to foster a strong risk culture, and we'll link it back to this model and those 3 elements. And again, we built some business cases and some exercises to think about how to identify and leverage those hallmarks. And we also have identified a number of risk culture red flags that we think can be added to your ERM toolkit to help to kind of identify where there could be some potential issues around risk culture that would warrant some attention. So with that, very high level sort of Reader's Digest overview of the framework. obviously a lot more content there. And hopefully, though, you've heard enough to motivate you to check out our website and to come out to our workshops and hear more and to participate in the ongoing collective learning and development of this framework. And on that note, I think I'll just hand it back to Richard.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we've invested quite a lot of time and effort into getting this all ready. It's part of the core seminar and education sessions we do. As you know, we provide a board risk oversight and insight program, which we do together with Rotman. This becomes part of the core curriculum of that session. In addition, my hope is that by early in the new year, we have an e-learning module for this entire program that you can offer to your new board members who maybe don't know a lot about risk management, new risk committee members who are in the same position, or other senior executives who really need a crash course on many of the topics that you're quite familiar with, but in fact are quite foreign to them. So that's really the direction we're going. The next steps in this process are a series of presentations that we're going to do between now, December, January, and February, where we're going to do seminars on each of those topics in a more detailed form. We'll be advertising that to our members. A lot of this material will show up on our website as well. And by the time we're finished this process, we're going to have a very comprehensive approach to risk management. Some organizations already have that, but I can tell you right now, most organizations wish they had. So happy to, that's it for the presentation. Happy to take any questions or comments that you might have.